Hi guy, and welcome to the AMIGArama podcast. I'm your host Lorfarius, and this week we'll be taking a look at Double Dragon, No Moaning in the Back. This one does have quite the reputation, so it's going to be interesting to see what it's actually like. But before we get into that, let's have a look at this week's news. First up was a game I noticed over on indieretronews.com called Pong 4K, and I'll just read out the blurb. Pong 4K for the Amiga CD32 is a fantastic game as a new entry into the homebrew scene. It sports a stunning soundtrack that demands the volume control to be turned up. The graphics give it that sci-fi vibe, and what's more, unlike the original Pong, this game is a revolving object in the centre of the screen that if hit incorrectly can cause the ball to smack back into your own goal. Now you just think, oh well, it's just Pong, it's simple, it's basic, but no, hang on a minute. This looks very, very strongly like a Bitmap Brothers game. The graphics are absolutely gorgeous. The scrolling and movement and the way the whole screen moves around and the background moves as well. It's very, very impressive, and I was having a quick go on it and it looked like a really good game. So yeah, I'd highly recommend that you go and download a copy. As usual, I will stick a link into the show notes. Next up was something called Monkey Business. Now, as usual, I am always a little bit behind on the news. It seems I'm several months behind on this one, but apparently this is a Macintosh port, which according to the Hall of Light, was reportedly the very first commercial game ever released for the Amiga, published in late 1985 by little-known US software company, the Other Valley Software. Now, this has been causing some ripples because a lot of people didn't even know it existed, and it's fully boxed with proper screenshots and it's been running. And it says here, whilst many Amiga gaming icons and enthusiasts alike believe that Mindwalker, coded by Bill Williams and released by Commodore in early '86, was the first ever commercial Amiga game, at least one or two pioneers involved in the Amiga's infancy contend otherwise. Based on anecdotal evidence currently available, Monkey Business, a low-budget Donkey Kong clone released for the A1000 by the Other Valley Software in late '85 on mail order and subsequently sold in US computer stores, was the first commercial game ever published for the Amiga. I've only seen this in screenshots and stuff that's online, and it doesn't look too bad. It's almost like a ColecoVision, I can't even pronounce that, or an Atari 2600 title. It's very basic. It does look quite impressive, and I'm sure that when it's running it's quite smooth and stuff because it's an Amiga game. Anyway, that's got a lot of people very excited. There's a full discussion. It's still going on. It's been going on for several months over on the EAB boards, and I will stick a note into the show notes. Before we switch over to the main show, I'd just like to take a moment to remind everybody you can pop along to iTunes and leave us a review if you're a long-term listener, or even if you've just started listening. That sort of thing does help bump the show up in the ratings when people come to find us. Plus, it's been months and I've not had a new one in ages, and I'd really appreciate it, guys. Thank you. It's always a tough one tackling arcade ports, especially ones as big as Double Dragon. It's pretty much the big beat 'em up, maybe even the earliest of its type, going right back into the 80s. And It's one of those I have loads of experience with, especially going to places like a local pizza parlour, and they had this single cabinet sat there. I mean, this would have been the late 80s, and I can remember it just being sat there at like 10p a go, and I would just spend hours in there. I wasn't even buying pizza or anything. They would let all these kids come flooding in, and we would play it like crazy, go down there with me mates, and there wasn't many arcade games around, except on the odd time when the local fair would pop round, but it was one of them things where it just looked really, and I started playing it, and it quickly became one of those favourite fighting games, especially over the years, and it's one I've always gone back to. And you have to hope that the home ports will be just as good, bring home that arcade excitement and the fun from playing it. And yeah, I'm not really convincing anybody there, am I? Because most of these arcade ports tend to be pretty terrible, so we're going to have to see how the Amiga version measures up. So let's just jump into it. Now, it was published by Melbourne House, and they did games like Xenon, Rockford, Arge, what an awesome title, Ultimate Golf, War in Middle Earth, etc, etc. They did quite a few titles, a very good mix as well, not just like arcade ports or licensed stuff, a fair few original games in there. That already sounds interesting right from the off, doesn't it? Now, it was developed by Binary Design, who also did Double Dragon 2, so the publisher must have been pleased with them. Feud, Road Wars, Shinobi, Speedboat Assassins, ooh, what an awesome sounding title, Vector Ball, loads and loads of different games and a good mix of arcade games thrown in there. Now, this came out in 1989 and it was on a single floppy disk. It is, of course, for 2 players. It would have been very strange if they'd done this game with less than that, and priced at £19.99. Now, the coder behind this was Gary Vine. He only worked on this and Double Dragon 2. Also, Pete Garside. He only did Double Dragon. This is not a good sign. And Richard Applin. Double Dragon 2. Final Fight. This is getting very worrying, isn't it? Godfather and Line of Fire. The graphics were done by Chris Collins, who did games like Puzznic. That's quite a good one, I think. Gauntlet 3. I think Puzznic was a ocean title where you had to roll around the edges and throw shapes into the middle to solve puzzles. I may be way off there. Hayden Dalton, who also worked on Assassin Special Edition, Dojo Dan, Gauntlet 3 and Overdrive. Now, nobody was responsible for the music on this game because it's just sampled straight from the coin-op. Now, it's just a standard Amiga port. There's no real history to go into it. I had a good look online for different interviews and articles and stuff, and there's just next to nothing. So we'll have a bit of a delve into some of the arcade history. And as usual, I will have to apologise for reading some of these names out because they're in Japanese and my terrible accent is going to destroy them. So apologies to anyone who is offended by this. This sort of stuff always reminds me of German lessons back at school where I was made to stand up before the class, try to pronounce words in German, which I had no chance of doing. Nine. I just can't do it. I can't speak any foreign languages, apologies. Anyway. Double Dragon was originally designed by Yoshihisa Kishimoto, that's not a bad attempt, who was working on Renegade 2, which I think is the sequel to Target Renegade, or was that like the UK or US title of that? Techno decided it was good enough to be made into its own game, so they came up with a worldwide release called Double Dragon. Now, the 2-player cooperative mode was actually an original idea by Techno's marketing department and isn't any sort of gameplay speciality. They just thought it would be more fun to play together and double the income. Yes, they're all about the sales. Yoshihisa was a huge fan of Bruce Lee and in particular his martial arts and movies, so he decided to name the main characters, the Lee brothers, after him, styling the game around Bruce's action movies and the way he moved and kicked and punched and stuff. I'm not so sure if that mixes in with his actual flying kicks that the brothers do in the game, but if you look at the characters, especially in the arcade game, they do look very big and similar in style to the sort of build that Bruce Lee had, so it was a very good match and it worked quite well. It also turns out that Bruce Lee's nickname is actually Little Dragon, hence the name Double Dragon after the two brothers. There's a lot of mention of the brothers, of course, and one thing that does come to mind is at the end of the game where you have to, it's quite famous really, especially for Double Dragon, you get to turn on each other and get to fight the other brother. And that came about because they just simply thought it would be fun to test the player's skills against the other person, because you spent all that time fighting with each other, you know, as a team, and then all of a sudden you got to turn around and beat the crud out of the other person. It wasn't something that was especially done at that time. This is pre like Street Fighter 2 and the fighting craze, you know, beat 'em ups were where it were, and no other game I don't think had this sort of a choice, so it was very, very unique to see. One of the game's most interesting features for the times that just was not seen in any other arcades was the ability to pick up different weapons and then use them against other people. Now, Technos did actually show this off to some degree in the original Renegade game, but sadly the weapons would drop to the floor. You just were not able to pick them up and use them against other people. So Double Dragon was striving forward there to do different things. I guess with it being a direct sequel to Renegade in the early stages before they rejigged it to be Double Dragon, it's sort of a natural progression really to move on to knocking these weapons down and being able to pick them up. Another impressive first that it applied was that it was the first beat-em-up game with real multi-screen length scrolling. Now that's used pretty much everywhere throughout the entire games and all over levels and stuff. It's something very simple, and it goes up, down, left and right. Doesn't sound anything fantastic, but this is the late 80s. Arcade machines just were not doing this at the time. It might not seem it, but the game itself was incredibly advanced for the time period. It was so difficult, in fact, to code that they actually had to release 10 different versions before they actually finally settled on the final one. Even then, it still never runs correctly. There's a lot of slowdown in there. They really are pushing that hardware to the extremes, and even going back on MAME, you can see that to this day. All of this hard work did pay off, as it actually became one of Techno's biggest games up to that point that they'd ever released. And of course it spawned so many sequels and remakes and follow-ons and ports in different places. There's things like Double Dragon 1, 2 and 3. I think at least 2 of them appear on the Amiga, though there was never a CD32 edition. And one other tidbit I missed out as well there. When you first start the game, you can see a red car parked in the garage as the background. This is actually the Road Blaster car, which recently saw a release on the Amiga CD32, I think the 1200. It's been hard drive rigged anyway, and you can see that over on EAB. And it was just a cheeky nod to the past games. I think that was a Laserdisc game. And the Amiga version was done by Brick Nash back in September 2017. Now, Double Dragon was ported to so many systems. They are the Amstrad CPC, all the Ataris, that's even the 2600, Commodore 64, MSX, Game Boy, NES, which is quite famous by things like the Wizard movie. I don't know if anyone remembers that. What a blast from the past. DOS Edition, Game Gear, Master System, Mega Drive, Genesis, ZX Spectrum. I think I had that one as a kid and I was quite addicted to it. I think it was a very good 128K port. That might be my memory. And a Tandy PC Junior version. So if you fancy some Double Dragon, there's a system out there for you. Double Dragon is the story of two twin brothers, Billy and Jimmy Lee, facing the odds together in a city where survival has to be learned the hard way. Their knowledge of the martial arts, combined with the experience of tough urban existence, has made them both formidable fighting machines, ready for any challenge that comes their way. But now the brothers are faced with their greatest challenge ever. Billy's girl, Marian, has been kidnapped by the Black Warriors, a savage and ruthless street gang led by the mysterious Shadow Boss. Using skills gained from a lifetime on the streets and whatever weapons come to hand, including knives, whips, baseball bats, rocks and even oil drums, Billy and Jimmy must pursue the gang through the sprawling slums, factories and outskirts of the city to reach the thugs' hideout for a final confrontation with the infamous Shadow Boss. This story isn't going to win any awards, it's nice and simple, and hopefully that's all you need for a good arcade game. Usually on most other ports and in the arcade game, you actually get this really neat animated intro and it's all like in-game graphics, and you get to see that Shadow Boss walk out and actually punch Marian in the stomach, knock her over his shoulder and carry her off with his gang. There's none of that in the Amiga version. It literally just throws you straight into the game, which is very odd as a lot of the other editions do it. I can't even think of any that doesn't do it, and it was the first thing that stood out to me when I saw the game. Despite being the main push for the story, she doesn't even turn up in the Amiga one right up at the end of the game when you see her dangling down from the ceiling on a rope. Spoilers, guys. You're presented with the typical Double Dragon beginning with the garage in the background and the red Road Blaster car. That looks all pretty good. Along the top of the display is the 1 and 2 player scores, as well as a timer, nice and simple, counting down. Along the bottom of the screen, you were shown a energy bar, which has got 5 levels to it. There's one on either side for both players. You also see the number of lives that you've got. The general look of the game is these huge big sprites with lots and lots of colour. Every character seems a lot thinner than the arcade counterpart. That might sound like an odd thing to pick up on, but when you're going off the arcade game, you want to base it as close as possible. And the build of the characters just looks a bit off. And remember, this is supposed to be based around like the whole Bruce Lee thing, and it's a style, and they just haven't gone to it, I don't think, in this version. When I've looked at the other ports and the ones I've played, unless of course you talk about like the Atari 2600, they don't seem to have this same problem. They all seem to match the arcade as closely as possible, but the Amiga just doesn't make them bulky enough. They're not the big muscly guys that they should be. They're a bit too thin. Of course, that's not something that would detract from the experience, but when you're playing an arcade port, you want it to look as close as possible, and it just feels a little bit off with that. Now, the controls for it, nice and simple. This is a single button game, so you're not using like multiple buttons, you're not stretching over to use the keyboard, and the way it works is you can move all over the place, up, down, left and right, all 8 directions on the joystick, but if you press like the fire button, you will punch or kick, and the way the controls work is you have to push a direction and hold fire at the same time. So if you press like I think it's diagonally down and fire, it will do like a jumping kick through the air, or off in a direction and up will do like an elbow, no, it's a headbutt and things like that. It's very, very strange how it's done. It does make sense when you're playing the game. There is a fair amount of options you can use when you're in the middle of a battle, at least, so they do bring everything over, so you've got all the elbows, the kicks that you want, the throws and all the rest of it, but it's very, very odd to be using it in the middle of the battle, and sadly you can actually get it quite wrong very, very easily, because when you're whipping the stick back, up, down, left and right and flying it all over the place, and then trying to remember these different button presses to directions with a button press to remember, it doesn't always work out, so it's a little bit off there. Overall, it controls pretty well, as much as you would expect it to. It's not going to win any sort of joystick or control awards. It's functional and it'll do the job. Now, you are given 3 lives with 5 continues, or credits as the manual and the actual game likes to call them. I've never seen that before on a home port. Again, I suppose it's trying to capture that arcade feel. Now, it does have all 5 of the arcade stages. They match the look. They are not anything fantastic. You've got things like the factory, the forest, the mountainside. There's nothing like over the top crazy with all. It's not like Battletoads or anything like that. I'll say Shadow Warrior with all these different flashing backgrounds or anything. It's perfectly functionable. It does the job. Each area looks as it should. They are just very basic looking, and that's part of the fault to do with the arcade machine, because they were all like based around cities and simplistic locations. You know, there was nothing over the top or crazy. Now, it does have some impressive scrolling, which the original arcade did. Not as much as the arcade, I'm sorry to say, but the fact is when it does move around the screen, it's perfectly smooth. There's no sort of slowdown. It moves like off in one direction, just as you would expect it to. As I said earlier, the arcade machine was a bit rife with slowdown because it was really pushing the hardware to extremes. Now, there is none of that in the Amiga edition. I'm not sure if that's a good or a bad thing. It's not like the arcade, but it's a little bit better in the sense that you're not getting stuck or massive frame skips in areas, so I think that's a big plus in its corner. One thing I have to mention is that there is not many sound effects. Keep in mind this is a fighting game, a beat 'em up, and what is there is repeated constantly, you know, knocking a character out does provide this like it's a funny squelch like scream, like a laugh off to the side. That does happen quite a lot. I can only imagine what that must have taken to come up with something like that. This one coding guy would have been sat there thinking, well, what's going to be funny? He's probably like flapping his elbow off the edge of the desk or something and making rude noises. But sadly there's so few of them, then it does become a bit of a detriment to the game as a whole. It follows the main arcade game quite closely, including things like enemy designs and bosses. Lots and lots of things repeat. You've got things like Bobo, the big muscly guy on the first stage. He appears several times throughout. Sometimes there'll be like two of him together. The only real big character that's any different is the final boss right at the end of the game. I'm not sure what they could have done. They were just doing an arcade port. It would have been nice to see them extend it out a little bit, do a few more enemies, not just like the same couple of guys over and over and the odd female character. Yes, there is a female character in here. She has a whip and oddly screams exactly the same as the guys when she gets hit and knocked down on the floor, which is a bit disappointing. There's also no music to speak of whatsoever except on the title screen, and that's just sample music straight from the arcade game. Usually at this point I would be going to lots of different details about the game, but I'm going to have to say, guys, this is quite the struggle to cover. There's not very many good things to say. We've not got to the bad section yet and I've already spoilt the surprise. Yeah, there's not a lot going on in this game. It's just a straight arcade port. They've not done anything fancy, but we'll try and break it down a bit and I'll do it as best as I can. So we need to talk about the problems with Double Dragon. Now, first off, the graphics simply aren't up to par. They are big, plain, ugly sprites. Even the NES edition looks better than this, and that might surprise a few of you because you know it's the Amiga, it's a 16-bit system. You would expect something which is a lot better with much better detail and rounded graphics, as close to the arcade as would be possible at the time, and this just does not get there at all. The graphical style for the original, it always reminds me of Shadow Warriors, and I was looking at the Amiga port of that because it's the first thing I always do when I think of Double Dragon in that game, because they're always linked in my mind because I remember playing them similarly at the time. And the Amiga port of Shadow Warriors looks the business. I'm not sure what happened with Double Dragon, but this is possibly a rush port. In fact, I'm pretty sure it is, because they haven't gone to any sort of detail or gone overboard in any way that they should have done. And again, you look at Shadow Warriors, they've tried to match the arcade. Of course, it's not perfect, but it's a very close match. They had the time, they put it in, they made the effort, and I've not played that extensively on the Amiga, but the fact I've seen a look of it, I like it. And then I look at Double Dragon and I just think, oh, what the hell happened there, guys? Now, the lack of music in the game is practically a crime. There's one thing that makes Double Dragon is the music, and it's simply not there. The main title theme that you get to listen to is sampled, but it's pretty poor, you know. It sounds tinny and off to the side. I'm not sure what they've recorded that on. It sounds absolutely awful, and it's no surprise that no one has put their name down to doing the music for this game, because it isn't very good. Again, I think this is a rush port. I might be wrong there. You never know with how things were going at the time, but they haven't made the effort they should have done with the music. There should have been lots and lots of different tunes across all of the levels, and it's silent throughout the entire game. Now, this is an arcade beat 'em up. You want action going on and pounding music whilst you're running around beating people up. And there's nothing. Again, just silence. The sound effects to go alongside this, the weapons sound the same as the actual punches. It's very, very peculiar, and it actually stands out whilst you're playing, because I was like, frowning and crossing my brows looking at this, and I'm thinking, well, I'm beating this guy with a bat or a stick or a whip, and it sounds exactly the same no matter what happens, no matter where you are. There's also no invulnerability when you get knocked down. I do hate that in a lot of games, but I will give it to this one. It's not really a bad point because it matches the arcade game. I was trying this out on MAME and having a quick knock around with it. It doesn't make for a fun experience though, and it would have been nice if they'd have tidied that in somewhere or edited it on, maybe, made it a little bit different. This isn't as good as the arcade game by far, you can probably tell that by now, so they could have done a few things to try and improve the thing they had, and stuff like the blinking or flashing when you got knocked down. It does happen after you've lost a life, very, very briefly, a couple of seconds if that, so they could have easily stretched it out. Next thing I will have to point out, this isn't the Amiga ports version, it could have been done better though. There is only ever at maximum 3 enemies on the screen at once, and this matches the arcade game where the hardware was really being taxed and they couldn't go more than that. The Amiga could though, and you've got these nice big wide sprites, big huge areas. You've got a lot of the time you've got just 1 or 2 enemies on the screen, and at maximum 3. It's not 3 enemies constantly all the time, especially when you go to say like the first and second levels where you're just starting out, and it can be ages before you meet the next set of people, and it's very, very odd. I wish they'd have put more enemies in there or increased it somehow. It's just very frustrating. Now, the game as a whole, it can be very, very easy to get through. On a push to get through, I managed to do it in 30 minutes. Now, I'm terrible at games, as I'm sure you've all seen from some of my gameplay footage. I managed this on my second go through, and I don't even know the game like 100% on this, and I was able to clear it and get through. And then there's nothing else to do after you finish it. You can just keep replaying it ad infinitum, and I suppose you could play it with other people and have the 2-player game. I didn't get a chance to try that, but to be honest, I didn't really want to. I don't think it would add much to this. And its biggest problem is it's just not a very good game. Now, the magazines at the time, Zap gave it 62%, The One gave it 3 out of 5, which is quite high for them, I thought. Raze gave it 84%, and Powerplay gave it 41%. It was quite an early Amiga title, so a lot of the mags just didn't exist, though none of them seem to have any good words to say about it. It's just, dear, oh dear, oh dear, just what the hell happened with this game? When I first started to play this, I felt like I was looking at a Commodore 64 game. There's nothing wrong with the C64, but it's an 8-bit computer. It's very basic looking, it matches that style. This is the Commodore Amiga, it's a 16-bit. It's almost arcade-like in some degree to the quality of games it can bring across. You look at some of the other arcade titles I've covered in the past, in particular things like R-Type, which are absolutely awesome and go overboard like with the graphical look. And then you look at this, Double Dragon, which is an even earlier game, and they just haven't, it's just not there. I mean, everything's there from the arcade. The levels look just about how they should, yet the graphics are just, they're ugly. I don't want to be having a go at the guy who made the game, because I suspect this one he was being rushed out of the door. The graphics are just ugly. It really does need taking back to the drawing board and redoing. It's passable in the sense that it does look similar to the arcade in like design and style-ish, but it doesn't get enough right. The really isn't much to the arcade game beyond like a basic beat 'em up. You know, this isn't something that is deep or in depth of like the Street Fighter games or even later things like say like the Streets of Rage titles, but this just fails on the Amiga on so many levels. I can understand that companies want to make a quick buck from games that they're releasing, at the same time charging £20 nearly, probably $25 over in the US, and I bet it sold a lot of copies off that license as well, and it's just a rip-off. I'd have been very, very annoyed, even buying this later on as a budget title. It feels like they've got the game's basic structure in place, and then they just gave up. I mean, the lack of music is absolutely appalling, and the level of difficulty through this means you were just gonna sail straight through. The only real good points I can even think of is that the speed is right. There's no arcade slowdown, which the original cabinet was quite famous for. That was pushing hardware boundaries, and the Amiga port is just, it never gets off the starting line. It just left there, you know, breathing in the dust of the other runners. The only major good thing I can say about it, at least, is that the character animations are actually quite good during the battle and the combat and stuff as you're moving around, seeing as most of the enemies are actually on repeat throughout. And I don't think this is, to be fair, it's not a fault of the port. They could have done more with it, but they were working off original material, and the arcade game does the same thing. Mixing, of course, the repeat colour palette swaps on some characters, it feels very lazy, but again, that's something to do with the original game's design. Now, this is quite early, I think, in AMIGArama's lifespan, but I have to say, this must be the worst arcade port that I've covered today, or even seen so far. I'm sure there's going to be other games which are equally as bad as this, or arcade ports that are equally as bad as this, or even worse, and I'm actually quite looking forward to covering them, because I want to know just how low it can actually go. Do they get much worse than this? By all means, drop me a line and let me know. And with that, it's time to bring this week's show to a close. As always, I would like to hand out a huge thank you to all of our Patreon supporters. They are Adam Bradley, Darren Coles, Figgy CTZ, Graham Vebke, Glenn Milford, Jason Warnes, O'Brien's Retro and Vintage, Retro Ravi, Richard Legg, Sneff and Treble. Of course, if you'd like to join their ranks, you can do so on patreon.com/AMIGArama. For all those that do join on the $4 tier, you can actually hear next week's episode a whole week early. If you've any comments about today's show, you can pop along to facebook.com/AMIGArama. I always reply on there. Twitter, which is @AMIGAramaPod, or even drop me an email on Lorfarius@AMIGArama.com. Until next time, guys.